Now, this checklist of questions has 5 major categories. And surprise, surprise, these categories are the fundamentals. They're composition, drawing, color, edges, and value. Think of these categories as tools. Well, really what they are is they're the skill sets that you need to have to paint. Just like the skill sets of a basketball player are to dribble, shoot, pass, run, and jump. And just like when a basketball player isn't performing well, they have to look at which one of these fundamentals they can improve at. You need to do the same with the painting fundamentals. All right, let's start with composition. When assessing your painting, always be asking yourself questions like, where is the horizon line? Is it smack dab in the middle? You might not want to do that. It's probably best to put it down towards the bottom or up towards the top. When you squint your eyes and look at the scene in just big shapes, are any of those big shapes too similar? You don't want similar size shapes. This is probably the #1 composition issue I see with students' work. As humans, we naturally want to make everything symmetrical and the same size and the same distance apart, but you gotta make sure not to do that. You can see with this landscape here, when I blur it and get rid of detail, you can make out these distinct dark shapes, and none of these shapes are similar in size. That makes the scene dynamic and interesting. Now, this is a plein air painting that I did about a year ago, and I was looking at it and I was thinking, something is off. So what did I do? I went through my checklist and I got the composition and I was like, this feels unbalanced. I got all this stuff happening in the top left corner. I need something to counter it in the bottom right corner. Now, I don't want it to be a dead even counter. I actually want it to be a little something there. Now, another way to explain what I'm looking at here is to think of it in terms of value shapes. You can see in black and white, there's a heavy amount of dark shapes in the top left, and I want to counter that with something dark in the bottom right. So I went back to the photo and I was looking, I was like, is there anything I can kind of put in there that would be dark? And there really wasn't. But when I looked at the uncropped version of the photo, I saw a tripod of mine and I saw the shadow of the tripod. And I was like, all right, well, that's nice. Now I know which way the sun's coming from that shadow. And I could probably get away with putting the shadow of a palm tree kind of coming from the bottom of the page into that corner, and that dark shadow will solve my composition problem. Now, another issue composition wise with this painting was the focal point. I wanted the focal point to be the kayaks, but it really wasn't working because it wasn't the area of highest contrast. There was too many other lighter areas from the sand and water, sky, that weren't making the lights of the kayaks pop against the dark of the bushes. So I knew in order to fix that compositional issue, I would need to kind of darken all these lights to a mid-tone. So once I did that and put in the shadow of my palm tree, I felt like the painting worked a lot better. It was much more balanced and my focal point was very clear. All right, let's move on to drawing. Whenever you're painting, always be thinking, is my drawing accurate? Are my shapes the right size? Are my angles correct? Now, drawing isn't just about lines and contours. It's also about the form. For example, of this painting I did of Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, something about her face was bothering me. I felt like it was too narrow and slender. But I checked the outside angles and contours and everything seemed right. But then I realized that I had incorrectly drawn in the front plane of the face. I needed to bring the light area of the cheeks over more to widen the face. So that's what I did, and after I did that, I liked the portrait a lot more. Drawing is a pretty straightforward thing to understand, but it might be hard to identify sometimes. So tips that I always suggest to see if your drawing is correct is put your painting upside down, put your reference photo upside down. You're gonna see drawing issues very easily there. Probably an even better way is to use a mirror. Looking at your painting in a mirror, at it reversed, it's gonna be very clear what angles are off, what shapes are off. You can also do this by taking a picture of it on your phone and mirroring it in your photo app. But it's just very important to get the drawing correct. That's why I'm constantly practicing my drawing. Especially of late, I've been wanting to get really good at the Loomis head method. So I'm constantly sketching little heads in my sketchbook. I also sketch out landscapes too. Before every landscape, I do small little thumbnail sketches to make sure I draw out the composition correctly. All right, let's move on to color. Ask yourself if you missed any opportunities to play up color complements against each other. For example, if you have some tree trunks, you can kind of push the red in them a little bit to counter the green in the leaves. Also ask yourself, are there any colors that are too desaturated, too browned down, too grayed down, that you need a little more vibrancy in those colors? Or the opposite, ask yourself, do you have too much saturated color? An example is in this portrait of a cat that I did. I made sure to keep the color of the fur pretty desaturated and grayed down. That way when I painted the color in the eyes very vibrant, they would have that much more punch to them because they were the only area in the painting with vibrant color. Now, if you struggle with mixing color, I actually offer the color mixing video from my Foundations of Oil Painting course for free. If you want to check that out, there's a link to it in the description of this video. Now, another question to ask yourself with color is, did you get the color relationships correct? For example, with this still life, you can see the flesh of the orange is much more orange than the juice right next to it. The juice has more yellow into it. And I was actually looking at my painting of this and realized that my color relationship there was off. I needed to push that juice a little more yellow so it wasn't as similar as the orange. Now this was easy to do because they're actually right next to each other in the photo, and sometimes they're not, and then it gets pretty tricky. Another question to ask yourself with color is, did I utilize color to create depth where I wanted? I was looking at this painting here and I realized, man, I could have pushed that second mountain a lot further in the distance by cooling the color down. So that's what I did. I made these shadows in these mountains a lot bluer because that's atmospheric perspective. As you get further in space, certain colors drop out. First yellows, then reds, and then you're left with blues. And I wasn't even looking at the photo reference for this. I just knew that that color shift would push those mountains in the distance. All right, now we're gonna move on to edges, but we're gonna stick on this mountain painting. The question you can ask yourself is, am I using edges to create distance? Using softer edges can help push things into the distance. So as I was cooling this mountain, I was also making sure to soften the edges of any shapes. And by the end, you can see how much softer the edges are than the mountain that's closer to us. So if you have a scene with mountains, trees, or anything far in the distance, and you got really harsh, crisp edges, think about it. Think if softening those edges will help sit it in the distance more and pull forward the things you want to come forward. Also ask yourself if you can harden edges. That's what I did in this painting here that actually was done completely from my imagination. I literally was just making it up as I go. But looking at it again, I was like, oh, I could probably harden some edges on these rocks to help communicate their solid form. Always be asking yourself, are my edges helping communicate the surface of a subject? I'm always using really soft edges when I'm painting hair in portraits, or I'm using broken edges when I'm painting the leaves of a tree. Edges are so important. You should always be asking yourself, am I utilizing a variety of edges to communicate what I want? All right, and last but not least is value. You should be asking yourself, are my value relationships correct? For example, going back to this orange juice painting, I noticed that the value relationships of the light side and the shadowed side of the peeled orange weren't correct. There wasn't a big enough contrast there. Either the shadow side wasn't dark enough or the light side wasn't light enough, or both, which is what it ended up being. Because I went back in there, I darkened the shadowed side, I put some more lights in on the light side, and I feel like at the end, making those changes really helped me portray the form because I was more accurate with the value relationships of the reference. Another thing I asked myself with value is kind of tied into composition, which is, where's the area of highest contrast? Because that area should be the focal point. For example, coming back to this landscape painting, when I put it in black and white, I noticed that the area of highest contrast wasn't the cowboy and the horse, which is what I wanted it to be. It was actually where these rocks hit this tree. I was like, I don't want that. I better darken those rocks and add some more lights into the cowboy and the horse. Another value issue with that painting that tied into composition was this long triangle dark shape that I specifically planned out in the composition to help point the viewer to the cowboy really wasn't reading because the rest of the river was too dark. And when I squinted my eye, I just got lost into the big dark shape of the river. So I made sure to go back and lighten that river so that shape that I originally planned out for the composition was more clear. And at the end, I really liked the changes and I felt like it helped make the painting a lot better. As always, if you'd like to see what I'm painting on a daily basis, you can follow me on Instagram at Forza43. I'm Chris Fornatero, here telling you to go get painting.